Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Danylo Lubkivsky, and I'm glad to welcome you on behalf of Kyiv Security Forum. Today we're holding the 10th online discussion of our forum. And what's most interesting is that recently our forum came under fire of a focused campaign, which bears obvious Russian traces. This means we are on the right track, and we will carry on. On May 24, a landmark event happened in the US-Ukraine relationship. Tens of Ukrainians, civil society activists, politicians, diplomats, and experts signed an address to American politicians and the American public, as well as to the Ukrainian society, in which they appealed to safeguard our strategic partnership. Let's stand together and not let anyone divide us. That is the main thrust of the message sent from Kyiv and initiated by Kyiv Security Forum. Just 2 days later, on the 26th of April, we received a reply. It was signed by 7 former US ambassadors to Ukraine, who, as a matter of fact, expressed the same kind of concern and repeated the same appeal as in the Ukrainian address. Let's stand together and not let anyone divide us. Such an exchange of statements is truly unique in our relationship. It is a unique transatlantic link, just like the strategic partnership between the US and Ukraine is unique. The two statements are a testament to the fortitude of people who are determined to defend the US-Ukraine relationship. And this is a note of caution to the leadership of both countries. Don't go wrong. This is also a signal to the enemies of our partnership. You won't be able to pit us against each other. But all this is not a sustainable solution yet. So how to resolve these issues, or to be more precise, how to address the provocations that can damage our relations? That's the topic of our today's discussion with our guests. I'm glad to introduce our American friends who kindly accepted our invitation to take part in the discussion. John Herbst, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine in 2003-2006. Thank you, John, for being with us. Dr. Celeste Wallander, Special Assistant to the U.S. President on Eurasia in 2013-2017, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Thank you for joining us. Stephen Pifer, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine in 1998-2000, our longtime and good friend. William Taylor, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine in 2006-2009, and U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in Ukraine in 2019-2020. On the Ukrainian side, it is my pleasure to welcome here Ms. Ivannna Klympush-Tsintsadze, Head of the Parliamentary Committee for Ukraine's Integration with the EU. Thank you, Ivanka. Vitaly Portnikov, a well-known Ukrainian journalist and publicist. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Head of Kyiv Security Forum and former Prime Minister of Ukraine. With this, I switch to the questions. The first one is to Vitaly Portnikov. Who is behind the attempts to damage the interests of Ukraine? And who will primarily benefit from the worsening relations between politicians of the two countries? The floor is yours. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the heads of the U.S. diplomatic mission in Ukraine's capital for their support of the desire of Ukrainian public to further develop our relations with the United States. This is yet another proof of the fact that the American diplomats, who have worked here since 1991, and the above-mentioned statement was signed by those who worked here since that time, have always understood all the challenges and risks facing our country, as well as the importance of our bilateral relations for both Ukraine and the United States. This means that throughout all those decades, our dialogue with the American diplomats was fruitful, and it obviously was a two-way street. By the way, I've always hoped it was the case. As my first dialogue with the first U.S. ambassador to Ukraine goes back to July 1991, just a few weeks before Ukraine's independence, during the visit of the then President of the U.S., George Bush Sr., to the then Soviet Union. And I've seen all these developments throughout all those years, and I'm very glad that professionalism and understanding of national interests have always been above some instant interests of political competition, which always exist in politics. And it is those time-serving competitive interests that I'd like to speak about. The story that we've seen unfolding over the last few weeks is also about converging interests. Take, for instance, the person who released these recordings. It's very straightforward. Mr. Derkach, who is a member of Ukraine's parliament, has always openly favored possible eastern direction of Ukraine's foreign policy, rather than Western one. Starting from the fact that he is a graduate of Russia's High School of Federal Security Service, all the way to his association with the people who have close ties with the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, sundry foundations related to this church and its informational and religious influence, the formation of groups of MPs in Ukraine's parliament who promote the idea of unity among Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Given all that, there's no point to accuse Mr. Derkach of doing something wrong, as it only stands to reason that he would use every opportunity to translate his political views into reality, to change the direction of his country's development, as he doesn't think the current one fit. There is also certain convergence of interests with President Zelensky's office. We saw this in the president's reaction to this situation. This convergence of interests is also in line with the ongoing fight of the president's office against the former president, Petro Poroshenko. They probably hope that this fight will make up for the lack of economic success of the incumbent government and its failure to address the dire social problems in Ukraine. And of course, it is an additional opportunity to demonstrate certain loyalty, not that much to the U.S. as a country, but to Mr. Trump, not as the president, but as a presidential candidate. It might seem to some in the president's office that this kind of loyalty will help develop the U.S.-Ukraine relations. And finally, as to who else might consider those developments beneficial in terms of time-serving vested interests. I'm talking about the future, or current rather, election campaigners of Mr. Trump, who are interested in undermining his main rival, former Vice President of the United States, Mr. Biden. But all those vested interests have no strategic character, because the strategic issue is about how the United States and Ukraine should develop to secure stability in the region. From this strategic point of view, what is going on runs counter to strategic interests of Ukraine as a nation, the interests of Ukrainian leadership as a stable government, to strategic interests of the U.S. as a nation, and the interests of its leadership as a stable government. It contradicts even the interests of Mr. Derkach himself, because if there is no stability in the region, there will be no stability in Russia, the country he is obviously leaning to. Thank you very much, Vitaly.
And now my question goes to Celeste Wallander. Celeste, thank you very much for joining us. Russia seems to be the biggest beneficiary of worsening US-Ukraine relationship. Russia is not only interfering into the US politics, but tries to smear as many actors and to establish as many new dividing lines as possible. How do you read Russia's tactics in the context of the upcoming US presidential elections? And especially now when President Trump calls G7 outdated and wants to invite Russia among others to a future summit. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much for including me in this discussion. It's a very timely one, and I'm privileged to be here with so many leaders who've contributed so much to our country's relationship, and to my colleagues who've served as ambassador of the United States to Ukraine, because they're not only friends of Ukraine, but in improving our relations with Ukraine, they're actually advancing American national interests, and they're great public servants and good friends. I think it's important to understand all the way back to the 2016 election that the Russian interference through social media, covert, overt operations, stealing of emails, release of compromising data, all was multifaceted. It had many elements, and it exploited existing debates and challenges and controversies in American politics. Russia did not create our political pluralism in the United States. It exploits it, and it exacerbates it, and it turns it towards more extreme views. And that worked in 2016 to disenfranchise a large number of American voters who were so disgusted with what they were seeing in targeted social media that many of them stayed home, for example. Many of them participated in protests against issues that actually weren't actual problems, but were created or advanced through those hack and release and social media operations. And the US experts, including US intelligence agencies, even this year have confirmed publicly that Russian operations are continuing to do that. They did it in 2018, our elections in 2018, less effectively, but they're already preparing and conducting such operations in 2020. And so we should very much assume that the opportunistic ability of Russian operations, which probably look a little different now than they did in 2016, because Russian agents are very good at updating and adapting and learning, that they are indeed exploiting and advancing and exacerbating any opportunity to create negative attitudes towards Ukraine and the United States. And I think that there's almost nothing we can do about that. There actually are actions that the US government can take and did take in 2018 to undermine those operations. But the best thing that we can do to undermine those operations and their effectiveness is to shine a light on them and to encourage American voters and citizens, and I hope Ukrainian voters and citizens, to be smart about how they can be manipulated and used, and to check information, to not allow themselves to be turned against what is actually a healthy pluralism in both countries.
Wonderful. I do thank you. This is very important for the Ukrainian audience, for the Ukrainian audience to deliver this message to the Ukrainians that the Russian propaganda is not going to stop someday. They are not fed up with what they are doing. They are trying to win. And this is the sense of the offensive they are ahead with. And now I turn to Ambassador John Herbst. And I thank you, John, for joining us. And let me immediately say that we are grateful to all former US ambassadors who signed the letter, signed the statement to support Ukraine-US strategic partnership, and that was an extremely important manifesto. And I thank for responding to our appeal that it means that we are on the same page. Ukraine has always been a matter of consensus, from what I remember personally, a matter of consensus for in the US domestic politics and for both political parties, both biggest political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. Contrary to Russia, how big and serious you think is the problem of turning Ukraine into a toxic narrative right now of the US politics? The floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, we should acknowledge that Steve Pifer was the principal drafter of that statement, so Steve deserves most of the credit for it. Regarding your question, certainly Ukraine as a possibly divisive issue in the United States was a severe problem late last year, but not so severe that even at that time, in December of 2019, you had Congress vote to increase military supplies to Ukraine by $50 million. You had Congress putting down greatly effective sanctions against Nord Stream 2. So even at the worst moment, you saw bipartisan activity in support of American interests in Ukraine at work. The danger today is not as large as it was 6 months ago, but it is still real because we have an upcoming presidential election. Former Vice President Biden is the likely nominee of the Democratic Party. So there are reasons to try and drum up the false narrative about his activities in Ukraine. So we will see more of this, and it is dangerous. But I think it will largely be contained because the source or the sources of the false narrative in Ukraine are understood to be corrupt, pro-Russian, and in some case Russian. So that's why the quote-unquote scandal of the tapes, right, that Ukraine is obsessing over right now, has not picked up any real traction in the United States. It is understood here that the quote-unquote scandal in Ukraine is driven by an unholy alliance of the Kremlin, corrupt individuals in Ukraine who do not want reform, and Kremlin-friendly voices in Ukraine. None of these people or none of these interests are legitimate. And this is pretty well understood here. So I am relatively confident, only relatively, that this problem of Ukraine as a divisive issue in the United States will be contained.
Thank you, John.
My next question is to Ms. Ivannna Klympush-Tsintsadze. Ambassador Herbst has just spoken about a very important dimension of the problem we're discussing today. The attempt of pro-Kremlin forces to stoke anti-Western sentiments in Ukraine, to stir them up and present them as a true reflection of public opinion. This obviously makes an impact on Ukraine's unity and its international standing. And it also has consequences for the current leadership of Ukraine, as there are intentions to replace it as Moscow sees fit. Are these threats properly understood by President Zelensky and his establishment? And what's also crucial, is the scope of the problem understood by the national opposition? Please. Thank you. I also would like to join in the chorus of this panel and thank the organizers of this discussion.
And I'm very happy to see all these great friends on the other side of the Atlantic, ambassadors, Celeste, happy to see you.
As regards the question you asked me, Danylo, as a matter of fact, we are dealing not just with Russian propaganda, which aims to stoke anti-Western sentiments in the Ukrainian society. This is also being done by the fifth column in Ukraine, within the so-called parliamentary mono-majority. And here one should understand that the ruling majority is the main parliamentary force. It is not homogeneous and has its own fifth column, which works, apart from other things, in the interests which are favorable for the Kremlin, including anti-Western propaganda. Likewise, there's quite a powerful fifth column of political forces, even NGOs, the so-called public movements, and the media, who also promote anti-Western rhetoric. I find it hard to say if the risk of this anti-Western rhetoric is properly understood by President Zelensky, because the way I see it, his perception of the world is based on several major factors, which include, for instance, the desire to be liked. That makes him want to look for quick fixes, to resort to populism and offer simple solutions. Or, for example, the wish to dominate. He kind of internalized the Soviet style of thinking, which prevails over the Western style of thinking, despite the young age of his team and the fact that these people are supposedly new to politics. Regrettably, the president's largely incompetent entourage does very little to help him grasp all the complexity of geopolitical and geo-economic processes Ukraine has been pulled into. Besides, he has this pathological repulsion to his predecessor, which gets the better of him and results in some emotional outbursts that unfortunately sometimes prevail over common sense and national interests. All that, in combination, prevents him from realizing the threats that come from the current reinforced wave of Russia's propaganda in Ukraine, which is being adapted all the time. Previously, we kept hearing that Ukraine is a failed state. This narrative is still around, but it's being reinforced with a new one, which is based on anti-Western rhetoric here. To me, it looks like the current leadership is between a rock and a hard place. They're trying to sit on the fence, propagating and supporting pro-Western course of Ukraine's development in line with the documents which are still in force in Ukraine. But the internalized convictions and inner mentality of the president and his entourage make themselves felt, and we increasingly often hear, even from the majority members, some reservations and doubts as to the need for more active steps towards the West. This causes concern because this way they, albeit unknowingly, which I still hope is the case, become transmitters of Russia's narrative in Ukraine. As to whether the opposition is aware of all those risks, I reckon we were aware of them even a year ago. We were flagging them up and cautioned people. Today, the opposition is firmly holding its ground, and that is what prevented the leadership from crossing some red lines, which they could have crossed and attempted to cross. Some things were prevented from happening, but this is not a sustainable solution. The way I see it, the major problem of the opposition is that it is still very much divided. I'm talking about the patriotic, statehood-oriented opposition. This problem is nothing new in Ukraine. We can stick together only when we are faced with a firing squad. Only then may we put aside our personal grievances and political infighting. I guess now is the time when Ukraine must come out as a united front. Because we are aware of all the dangers of Russian propaganda and have the experience of successful counteraction to this propaganda. Thank you. I believe that the fact that the statement in support of the American-Ukrainian partnership was signed by people from so many political and social strata gives us good chances and hope for the future.
And now I go with my question to Steve Pifer. Excellency, among other things, Ivannka mentioned one very important issue, the lack of institutional memory. In 2001, then President Kuchma found himself internationally isolated because of the Kulchuga scandal, a scandal around the accusation of selling Kulchuga radar system to Iraq. At that time, our relations were severely hit. And at that time, you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with responsibility for Ukraine and Russia. From your experience, Excellency, what kind of harm and danger may a new scandal provoke? Can its negative development apparently impact the overall international activities of President Zelensky?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for including me in this exchange. No, I do worry that while the U.S.-Ukraine relationship is a solid one, that what we are seeing is an effort to undermine and weaken that relationship. And it's going to be attacked both from people in Ukraine. We saw the release of the recordings by Mr. Derkach. From what I can tell of those recordings, they reveal nothing that we did not already know. I mean, it was already well known that Vice President Biden urged then President Poroshenko to fire Prosecutor General Shokin because Mr. Shokin was not doing his job. You know, there's no new story here, but it's been targeted in a way to try to undermine that relationship. And I think we have to understand the motivations behind it. It comes from Mr. Derkach. This was, of course, somebody who went to the KGB Academy in Moscow, who is clearly shown a pro-Russian bias. So he's launched that attack. And I do fear that there are people in America who will try to pick it up and amplify it. Mr. Giuliani is still very busy. He works with a cable television network, the One American News Network, which I had never heard of until about 3 months ago. And they are trying to amplify this story. And so we have to be very conscious that there is this effort to undermine this relationship that is driven by forces that are hostile to seeing a strong relationship between Washington and Kyiv. And that likely includes forces in Moscow. I cannot imagine that Russia, looking at these developments, if they did not have an active hand in it, and I suspect they might have, they are thoroughly happy that you have this kind of story eating at the foundation of the relationship that we've built over the last 2.5, 3 decades. So it's important to be very mindful of what is driving this, what is behind this, and the risk that it could pose to a relationship that I would argue serves both the interests of the United States and of Ukraine.
Thank you, Steve. And my next question goes to Ambassador Taylor. Excellency, together with Ukrainian ambassadors Mocek and Charlie, with the US ambassadors Payet and Mary Yovanovich, you did a lot to ensure a robust relationship between Ukraine and the United States in the time of Russia's offensive. Scandals come and go. Real results remain clear and solid. From the latest news to what I read yesterday, the Pentagon has notified the US Congress that Ukraine's government has made the necessary progress on key institutional reforms and justified the additional $125 million in new military assistance. That's a good sign. Does the US political establishment distinguish a new and real Ukraine from those who provoke, from those who consciously or unconsciously drag Ukraine into the US competition? And are we protected against losing this kind of understanding? The floor is yours, sir.
Danylo, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me along with the others to join this. And it's a good question. And the answer to your last question, let me do that first. That is Ukraine protected from losing this distinction, this understanding that there is a new Ukraine from the old Ukraine? And the answer is there is a risk. there is a risk because the United States, in particular, the people who follow the Ukrainian-U.S. relationship closely, a lot of people on this call, but many others as well, will look to see what people say. And they will look to see what the president says, and the foreign minister says, and the former prime minister says. We will listen very carefully to Ukrainians. And we will be listening for the two kinds of stories and which story prevails. And as I've said before, in Washington, which gets to your question, Danylo, there are two Ukrainian stories. One story is the old Ukraine, and I include that in the categories of corruption, and I would now put it in the impeachment story, and the difficulties that all of that has raised for Ukraine. That's the negative story. But there is a better story. There's a positive story. There is the bipartisan story about Ukraine that you have described, and that people on this call have described, and that we have to emphasize and understand, but listen for. If that story, that is Ukraine, that is trying to establish itself, that is defending itself against the Russian attack and war that the Russians are imposing, are aggressive, the aggression that the Russians have against Ukraine, that understanding that the United States has of Ukraine defending itself, just trying to be a normal European country. That's what the Ukrainians, that story is a positive one. That's the story, Danylo, that several people have suggested, have observed, gets bipartisan support and has had bipartisan support and did result in this additional military assistance that you just described. That's the positive story which we have to listen for, but it's not guaranteed. That is, if there are other people, mainly in Ukraine, who want to tell the other story, that's out there. So Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian people have to emphasize what they value and where they want to go. And that's the positive story that we will hear.
I thank you for this answer.
My next question is to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. Ukrainian politicians often say, "Don't drag us into the U.S. domestic politics." But the fact is that Ukraine is already dragged into American political processes. We need to be wise and exercise restraint, but we can't assume an ostrich attitude and hide from problems and threats. What's the best way to go about it? What do you think we should do? The Ukrainian-American relations are going through times of trials. And it is not because we betrayed each other in our bilateral relations. We've always been honest and open with each other, the USA and Ukraine. But a third party has appeared, the Russian Federation, which, since the early 2000s, has been doing its utmost to undermine our strategic alliance. What has been going on since 2016, I can call one of the most sophisticated, one of the most elaborate operations by the Russian Federal Security Service and the main intelligence directorate of Russia's Ministry of Defense, aimed to undermine the bilateral relations between Ukraine and the United States of America, as well as to undermine unity between the US and Europe and among Ukraine, the US, and Europe. Luckily, there are some numbers that show that our relations remain very stable and solid. Especially for our American friends, I picked some survey numbers showing the attitude of Ukrainians toward the USA. Please be aware that the top 3 countries that Ukrainians name as partners are Poland, the United States, and Germany. Each fourth Ukrainian says the US is our strategic partner. I looked at a very interesting public opinion survey of 2019 done by Americans. It's Global Attitude Survey. And according to this poll, I can tell our American friends that the attitude of Ukrainians to the US is better than that of your ally, Great Britain. Because 57% of the British have a positive attitude toward the US, and as much as 72% of Ukrainians have a positive attitude toward the USA. That means we have a very solid foundation for our bilateral relations. Ukrainians believe in America and the American people. Of course, now, as I've already said, our relations are going to be tested. But we will pass this test. Never ever did I hear or be otherwise aware that any American leader or anybody in the US administration interfered into Ukraine's internal affairs. All I know is that American leaders have always helped Ukraine, that American leaders had open and honest discussions with Ukraine's authorities as to how to make Ukraine stronger, that American leaders have always made sure that the final decisions regarding Ukraine are made by Ukraine's authorities and Ukraine's political establishment. A strong Ukraine is in the interests of the United States. Because for Americans, a question can arise. Why are we fighting for Ukraine? It's far away, across the ocean. What are the interests of the American nation in Ukraine? The interests are most direct. A strong, successful, and secure Ukraine is a key priority of national security of the United States. Because on our European continent, the main threat to Europe and the US comes from Russia. Likewise to the Ukrainian people. What is the key priority for Ukraine? It's our security, and it's our European way, our way to the West. And our American partners have always stood by Ukraine, always helped Ukraine. And we value that. The United States has always defended Europe and has always defended Ukraine, and defends it now. We'll go through this time of trials. We have enough fortitude, enough resilience, and what matters most is that the truth is on our side.
As we turn to the second part of our discussion, I'm going to, and first of all, I wish to express the words of support addressed from Ukraine to America in these times of difficult trials, violence, pandemic, social hurdles that you experience right now. And for that, please accept this message of solidarity which comes from Kyiv these days. Along with many politicians and diplomats and experts, there are a few other actors that may play a decisive role in our relations. These are our societies and public opinions. And my question goes to Ambassador John Herbst. John, do you hear me? What should be done to have real Ukraine's message heard by the Americans? In a wider sense, what should be done to have our message heard by the American society, in your opinion? The floor is yours.
Well, most importantly, Ukrainian leaders need to speak out clearly and emphasize the right points. One, the importance of the bilateral relationship. Two, their determination to prevent any incidents of interference in American elections. Three, to underscore the challenge that they face. So you need forthright speaking. But secondly, the most important thing that the government in Ukraine can do, that the Rada in Ukraine can do, is to move forward on reform. Because a principle propaganda point for the Kremlin in the United States and in Western Europe is that Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt. So make progress on reform, which is critical to Ukraine's interests, even without reference to the United States, and that will bring you additional advantages in the US. One last point. I think we all understand that the main instruments of media in Ukraine are a problem. Many of them are sympathetic or somehow beholden to Kremlin interests. It would be useful if Ukraine were to make use of monopoly laws or anti-monopoly laws to address this problem. And some of those laws are already on your books, especially relating to ownership of media.
100%. I share this point. That's absolutely true.
My next question is to Vitaly Portnikov. How do you think our civil society can clearly get it across to Ukraine's leadership that any actions that can damage such a key and crucial asset as the Ukraine-US strategic partnership can turn out to be fatal? I believe we're already doing that. We say that it's crucial, especially before such events as the US election, to maintain absolute political and informational hygiene. After what happened during the last election campaign, when both Democrats and Republicans kept accusing Russia of meddling in the election, it would be not just a fatal, but a childish mistake for Ukraine to openly, legally, and with the involvement of its judiciary, get involved into American political life and interfere, not as individual people, but as a state, into U.S. election. It seems to me that the story of meddling into the U.S. election, the story with the recordings, falls under the same category. Attempts are being made to persuade the U.S. that Ukrainians don't know what they are doing, that they are not fit to be a state. That is Putin's perennial message. They don't even understand the consequences of their own steps. The conclusion he is prompting is very simple. Let us build state institutions for them together. Let's find professionals for them under our joint leadership. And any joint leadership between Moscow and the West, as Moldova's experience shows, ends up as Moscow's leadership. That's what we have to try and get across to our American friends and to Ukraine's leaders. They should understand that all this will not result in a deal. They will simply be replaced with a kind of recovery administration, which will very soon turn into occupational administration. My next question is to Ms. Ivannna Klympush-Tsintsadze. We have a very important dimension of our engagement with the U.S., interparliamentary dialogue. It's key for us to maintain this bipartisan solidarity toward Ukraine within the U.S. Congress. In your opinion, what could be done through parliamentary dimension? Does the Verkhovna Rada have any potential to do something to help salvage our relationship and protect it from Russia's provocations? In our parliamentary diplomacy is a very serious instrument of state policy. And we, by the way, saw that in the parliament of the previous convocation. At that time, the parliament had its own position, which was very much aligned with the position of the government and the president, and what's more important, with the position of the civil society. And when such a systemic and comprehensive work is being done, one can expect results. Unfortunately, the 9th convocation of the Verkhovna Rada does not have this external voice. We can't even adopt some watered-down statements to foreign parliaments, international institutions, or parliamentary assemblies of other countries. This is a serious problem and the whole country suffers from that. Even though it might seem like all the preconditions for systemic engagement on the international arena, including with the executive bodies of power, are in place. But there is a serious impediment to that. It is primarily about the lack of independent decision-making on the part of the majority MPs. They are simply not prepared to take an independent stand and make their case, including vis-à-vis the presidential office. That is why even the interparliamentary group of friendship we have with the US was formed in such a way that its leadership includes only representatives of the Servant of the People Party. We even jokingly call it the group of friendship between the Servant of the People Party and the US Congress. Having said that, there's a conscious and statehood-oriented nucleus within the majority faction. So like-minded MPs from other factions should engage with them in order to raise awareness and encourage them to consistent and systemic work on the international arena. It is possible. Sometimes we manage to do this in our joint delegations to various parliamentary assemblies, but this is more of an exception rather than the rule. So theoretically the potential exists, but it's very weak, since parliamentarianism in Ukraine has been seriously damaged. Because of this
sweeping victory that was received a year ago by the president
and this victory and massive support for the current ruling party makes it impossible to produce parliamentary decisions which would be supported by other sides. I believe that today we all together with the civic society and politicians, have to use some non-linear and maybe non-systemic ways of maintaining the dialogue with our partners in the US, in order to show them that there are robust political forces in Ukraine that understand the strategic goals of our relationship and the interests of our countries in the context of short, medium, and long-term planning. Thank you very much. And our today's discussion shows that such an understanding does exist in the broad civil society.
Ambassador Taylor, my next question is addressed to you. There is already a special Ukrainian school of thought in the US diplomacy. The friends of Ukraine include former presidents, members of the Senate and the House, ambassadors and diplomats, public intellectuals, business environment. The voice of this influential group is very, very needed these days. We need strategic thinking and action, not a rivalry, domestic or bilateral. We need strategic vision of our relationship. Who can pass the message to the White House that the Ukrainian affairs request thoughtfulness and responsibility, not a revenge, not even a Giuliani's adventurism? Who can raise up the level of the political dialogue between Kyiv and DC? What strategic priorities would you suggest for Ukraine's current Ukraine-US current cooperation? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Danylo. As several of my colleagues have already mentioned, there is broad support, bipartisan support for Ukraine in the United States. And I would look, in answer to your question, I would look to the House and the Senate for their input into the White House and into the society. The House and the Senate have been leaders in this thing. And we've talked about the broad support for additional assistance, broad support for sanctions against the Russians, broad support for the financial and military support for Ukraine that we've seen over the years. So that, I would say, in the first instance from our Congress, the House and the Senate. But I would also say that there is an understanding in the State Department that this is important, and that they will be a voice. The people in the State Department will be a voice, making this case very clearly within the councils of the government at the senior levels of the State Department. So I am confident that that message will get through across our government. Danylo, you asked for the areas for cooperation. Again, John Herbst has already mentioned the anti-corruption reform effort. That's very important, and he's exactly right that will emphasize the positive story about Ukraine that I mentioned before. But I would also mention the other big priority, of course, in Ukraine is the defense against the Russian aggression. And I noticed that the current deputy prime minister, has recently suggested going back to the format of the Budapest Memorandum, and not to put aside the Minsk effort, but to go beyond that, to supplement it. And that means the Brits and the Americans could play a role. That invitation, I think, is important. And I think if it is clear that participation would be welcome, then either now or soon, the Americans could step forward.
I thank you, William. Ambassador Pifer. And now we turn to some wider international picture, and the international situation looks grim. That's from Kyiv's perspective. Chancellor Merkel has rebuffed President Trump's invitation to attend a G7 summit. President Trump considers to invite Russia to that summit somewhere in the coming months. Hong Kong law drives wedge between the European Union and the United States and the United Kingdom. Don't you find that until the US presidential elections, the West will lack necessary political unity, and how it may influence Ukraine and Ukrainian affairs, in your opinion? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Let me first say that I do think it is a mistake to invite Russia back to participation in the G7. The United States, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Canada, and Italy chose to expel Russia from the G8 back in 2014 because of Russia's seizure of Crimea and Russia's promotion of a conflict in Donbass. And none of that's changed. There's no reasons to bring the Russians back. But I do think what we've seen here reflects a broader problem, which unfortunately may make it more difficult for the United States to engage in the next 6 months in a helpful way to help Ukraine move closer to a resolution of the conflict in Donbass, regardless of the format. And that is, you have, I think, in President Trump, somebody who has clearly been overwhelmed by the domestic crisis here, the pandemic with more than 100,000 Americans dead, 40 million unemployed, the economic consequences, and somebody I think is clearly focused first and foremost now, not on addressing those problems, except as addressing those problems could contribute to his reelection. So I'm not sure at this point in time that Kyiv can, with much hope, look to the United States to play a helpful role. I regret that because I think the United States should be doing things to help Ukraine deal and resist the conflict against Russia. And to a certain extent, I mean, the American bureaucracy, those people at the State Department and the Defense Department who work on Ukraine, will continue to go forward. But I don't think in the next 6 months you're going to see engagement at the American presidential level that could be used in a helpful way to try to bring about a solution to the ongoing simmering conflict in Donbass. I regret that. I wish it was otherwise, but I just don't see anything other being realistic.
That's quite a pessimistic view, Steve, but let us look at the dark side of the moon, even more pessimistic. Celeste, if I may, in your article of 2018 in the Foreign Affairs, you wrote, illiberal and non-democratic countries are more vulnerable to subversion, and which is absolutely true. The most recent polls in Russia show a serious decline of people's trust in Putin. Only 25% now of Russians still trust him. This is what the Levada Center says. Don't you find that such kind of decline in the authoritarian country may provoke new forms of aggression? And what should the West then expect? And how should we all protect ourselves? The floor is yours.
Well, Russia is facing multiple crises of its own. Recent expert predictions are that the Russian economy will shrink. Sort of optimistic views are merely 4%, more pessimistic views of 10%. And disproportionately, there will be failures of small and medium enterprises, which are the main drivers of innovation and employment in the Russian economy. So the American unemployment numbers look bad. Something up to 30% of Russian employment resides in that sector, and it's going to get knocked out by both this recession and the Russian government's failure to cope with it. So the chance for protests, the chance for discontent, the falling popularity is significant. And what we've seen is the Kremlin try to make up for that with a focus on its World War II narrative. I think we should be very cautious and watch carefully for any crises on the Russian periphery if the Kremlin believes that it has an opportunity to distract the population. But I'd like to, since we're speaking in a Ukrainian context and you will have Ukrainian listeners, I am more worried that actually the Kremlin will seek to escape the costs of sanctions in order to jumpstart its economy, and not by an honorable and honest implementation of the Minsk agreements, one that returns Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and finally reintegrates the poor Ukrainian citizens of the Donbass, but instead by manipulating the process and trying once again to fracture the United States and Europe and win that way. So as much as we do need to be alert for a potential Russian, I agree that the Kremlin is going to look for ways to distract from its own misrule within Russia. But I think that we should be as worried about diplomatic manipulations surrounding the Minsk process and attempts to escape sanctions that way as new adventures.
I do thank you. Mr. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, this is how our guests, how our participants see that international picture and the picture of the Ukraine-US relations. In your opinion, or given your experience, what kind of message would you send to DC these days? And what kind of message would you pass to the official authorities here in Kyiv? The floor is yours.
You know, Ambassador John Herbst, he raised an issue of meddling into the elections. And I want to be very clear. It is crystal clear who meddled into the US elections. Russian Federation. It is crystal clear who meddled into Brexit, into Dutch referendum, into German elections, into French elections. And we can continue this line. It's Russian Federation. It is crystal clear who violated the international order. Russia. It's absolutely clear that Russia illegally annexed Crimea and sent its proxies to Donetsk and Lugansk. No doubt that Russian proxies shot down MH17. No doubt that Russian special agents tried to assassinate on the UK soil British citizens in Salisbury. And it's a very long story of the Russian covert and overt operations against the West and against the Ukraine. Russian idea is, you know what is the Russian idea? It's quite simple as it is. Those who support Ukraine in the United States, they want them to keep silence. And those who strongly oppose, or those who buy these fake stories about Ukraine or meddling of Ukraine into these elections, they want them to speak loudly. So they want to undermine our unity. They want to sell their own story. And what Celeste just said, an extremely important thing. It's another part of the Russian story and part of the Russian playbook. To say, look, it's not us as the Russian Federation, it's Ukrainians who violated the Minsk deal. They are not acting in good faith. Let's put the blame on Ukraine. Let's put the blame on the victim, not on the aggressor. It's weird, it's unacceptable to have Russia sitting at the G7 table. Well, it's acceptable for Russia to sit in Hague, but not in G7 meeting. The reason why I'm telling this is that, look, it's a very challenging time for our bilateral relations. The stronger we are, the stronger you are. And it plays vice versa. This is a win-win situation for all of us. And Russia wants to have lose-lose situation for Ukraine and for the United States.
I thank you. And now, as we turn to the final part, very brief part of our conversation, let me ask you to make just a brief concluding remark or message that you would like to send to the Ukrainian and international audience. And I'm going to start by asking Ivannka Klympush-Tsintsadze to tell her concluding message to our viewers.
I believe that while each of our countries has on its plate a considerable number of serious challenges, economic, social, medical, and otherwise, and when the issues of our mutual relationship is not all that high on the agenda, it is crucial to understand that this is not an exclusively American or Ukrainian responsibility, that this is our shared responsibility. Those who understand the importance of our relations for each of our countries, therefore we must do everything possible to make sure that we go through this trial and do it with dignity and emerge with even deeper understanding of each other and understanding of the fact that for the national interests of each of our countries, development, security, and friendship with the other is of crucial importance. Thank you very much. Vitaly Portnikov. One final message, just in one sentence. What would you like to say to our audience? What message you would like to send? In the wake of the release of the so-called Derkach recordings, President Zelensky enjoys bipartisan support in the US, and the only thing he is interested to know is how the recordings were made. And that is the most important thing, that we influence the position of the Ukrainian leadership, and we should continue to do so in the positive vein.
Dear John, your concluding message.
I was delighted to see the interview that President Zelensky gave with the British newspaper. I think that some of the problems connected with his press conference. As we discussed earlier, the tapes are non-scandal and non-news. It's important that they be treated that way and they not become a reason for investigations in Ukraine. That would be my advice to sign off this event.
Good. Stephen Pifer, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Danylo. I think these are very difficult times for both of our countries as we both have to cope with the pandemic. We both have to cope with the very difficult economic circumstances that have been caused by that pandemic. But it's going to be important that we remember the values that link our two countries, the value of the relationship between the United States and Ukraine, to both countries' national interests. We should remember that and value that, particularly at a time when I think we've seen, as with Mr. Derkach's release of these tapes, that there is going to be, in the next 6 months, a directed effort to try to divide our two countries and to try to undermine a relationship which is in the interest of both our countries.
I do appreciate. William Taylor.
Thank you, Danylo. I would reinforce what Ambassador Pifer just said. That is, don't take the bait. There will be people who will try to get the Ukrainian government to get involved in U.S. domestic politics. That's a mistake. So don't take the bait. And I'd go back to something that the Deputy Prime Minister said. Ivannna Klympush-Tsintsadze said, Ukrainians need to pull together. Ukrainians are stronger when they're united. Opposition, government, in the Rada, there's a move, there's a group that goes across parties that will do exactly what Ambassador Pifer just said, and that is emphasize the values. These are common values, and it goes across Ukrainian politics, and it goes across U.S. politics.
Thank you. Celeste Wallander.
I think the important message is that reinforces what you've just heard, that American foreign policy is an expression of national interests, of our societal interests. We have governments that come and go every 4 years. The bipartisan nature of the commitment to our strategic partners, Ukraine among them, but also allies in Europe and in Asia, sustains those changes in elections every 4 years. And Ukrainians ought to be thinking about the fact that it's not just about the names in the headline in any given moment, but it's the interests and the commitment of the American people that stands behind that strategic partnership. And that's what they should be looking towards the next few months as we go through our own election season.
Thank you. I do appreciate. Arseniy Yatsenyuk.
I support the view of our American friends that President Zelensky gave a good interview to the British publication The Telegraph. I can tell you that after this trial, Ukraine and the USA should become even stronger. We have always counted and do count on bipartisan support. The American people should always know that Ukraine and Ukrainians have a lot of respect for the United States, its people, and its leaders, and that our strategic partnership is key to having a secure, prosperous, and successful Europe, and Ukraine as a member of the European Union. I would like to thank all the participants of today's discussion for this very important exchange. On behalf of Kyiv Security Forum, I'd like to thank all the Ukrainian civil activists, politicians, experts, and diplomats who signed our joint statement about the US-Ukraine strategic partnership. I would like to thank our American friends.
I would like to thank Ambassadors Roman Popodyuk, Stephen Pifer, Carlos Pascual, John Herbst, William Taylor, John Taft, and Mary Yovanovich for their statement and true example of dignity and professionalism. We do appreciate your appeal. And I thank the Atlantic Council, our good friends, our buddies, those brothers and sisters in arms who stay with us and help making this event possible. So this is our warm gratitude and greetings to the Atlantic Council. We believe in our strategic partnership. Let's not allow mutual distrust and doubt. Let us stand together in times of great trials. I do appreciate. Дуже дякую.